Hey, welcome to another podcast with Stephen Corey, also known as SOS, because God knows we need all the help we can get, and we're also here to try to help you provide some help too, just in case if you need it. So like we always said before in every podcast, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please let us know. We'll try to get you on the air, do a little interview, and we'll help spread the knowledge around. So that being said, I'm going to shut up here for a quick minute, turn it over to Corey, let Corey introduce our special guest we have going today, and get the ball rolling here. Corey, show's all yours, buddy.
Appreciate it, Steve. Yeah, welcome back, everyone. As Steve said, it's Standards of Safety, SOS podcast. And we do have an exceptional guest on our show today for you. So we're talking about the down and dirty of the workman's comp, and we're going to answer the questions on how to recognize some fraudulent workers' compensation claims. So as in the safety field, every safety officer has had experience with the workplace injuries and illnesses, but the area of the workman's compensation seems to pose, a lot of questions and concerns. And although we're involved with work comp, many of us have little to no experience or training on the subject, right? So, however, we have all had our share of individuals that seem to be faking an injury, okay, or just trying to get a long weekend off. We've dealt with that from time to time throughout our career. Every one of us have. So what do we do in those situations, and how can we stop those individuals from taking advantage of the way workman's comp is? And part of what the special guest that we have today is very knowledgeable in it. And which he will probably explain to me, but to my knowledge, workman's comp is it's a no fault system. Right. So if you just get hurt on the job, it doesn't matter if it's your fault or the job's fault. Workman's comp's there to take care of you. So when those situations come up, how do we know the individuals that are actually taking advantage of it, and what's the best ways to try to stop those? So it's with these questions, our special guest today, Phil, going to be on the show, is going to be able to answer a lot of these questions for us. Just to give you a little bit of a background, this guy is very heavily credentialed. Okay, he's extremely, I forgot the word I'm looking for, but extinguished. Right, he's a retired Air Force officer with a bachelor's degree in nursing and a master's in public health, University of Texas, UT. Go Texas, baby! I'm originally from Texas, so I got to throw that out there.
Hook 'em horns, hook 'em horns.
Hey, hook 'em horns, right? So. He also has extensive nursing experience with certifications in emergency nursing, trauma, medical, surgical care as well. Occupational health, disability management, case management. As a certified occupational health nurse and case manager, he's also got extensive knowledge and certifications and experience in delivery of health and safety programs or services to protect workers from injury and illnesses. In the medical care and case management, he's also educated in state and federal regulations involving OSHA, Family Medical Leave Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, Workers' Compensation. And like I said, the guy is extremely extinguished, right? So during his 20 years in the public sector, he spent over 12 years managing workers' compensation programs and administering claims, which gives him the day-to-day knowledge to help us answer our questions today. And hopefully by the end of this podcast, you'll get the down and dirty of workers' compensation, right? So Phil, we're going to turn it over. In your experience, have you ever had any fraudulent work comp claims? And if so, what did you do about them?
Well, thanks for having me on your show today. And yes, I have had experience with fraudulent claims, and they can be really difficult to manage. Even when your common sense tells you there is something wrong with an injury claim, the workers' compensation rules make it very difficult sometimes to call it fraudulent. But as safety officers, you guys and girls are the employer's first line of defense in helping us to identify and deal with fraud. And the information you can obtain is just invaluable to the workers' compensation claims examiner or case manager, who's ultimately going to be the person to fight on the employer's behalf if there is the possibility of fraud. So your position is extremely important. And so many times in my career, it's been overlooked, or the information that you can provide has not been available. So we haven't had any way to argue against a claim. So let me explain a little bit. Every state has workers' compensation laws that make an employer responsible for the medical care of employees that sustain work-related injuries or illnesses. Nebraska is no exception. They've had rules since 1913. And employers are also responsible for paying employees for any time off work that may occur because of an injury or illness. And those rules are put into place to also protect employers, so that because it's called a it's a no-fault system, as you mentioned. It doesn't matter whose fault it is, but it's also put in there so that the employee doesn't have to go take an employer to court to argue that whose fault it is, and the employer doesn't have to go to court and pick up all those costs that go into a civil suit that might be put up against them. So it can be a win-win for everybody. A work comp claim, it always starts with a first report of injury, and that report of injury should be in writing, and it's got to be by the employee, but it can also just be verbal. But it's got to be done. The employee has to tell us that they think that they've been injured on the job. However, that report can start by an employee simply telling his supervisor or an employer's representative, a foreman, a manager of some kind, that he thinks he was hurt on the job. And under the Nebraska statute, that report must be made, and here's the wording, as soon as practicable. Note that that wording is very vague. And that statement, as soon as practicable, what does that mean? Well, as such, it can have many interpretations, and employers should always make sure they educate their workers to report injuries or illnesses immediately to help reduce some of that vagueness, or maybe use the word right away. That might also be a little bit better. And some injuries are simple. You cut your hand, you start bleeding. Clearly, the employee knows he's injured and should stop work to report it so he can get medical care. So those are obvious. Other injuries, though, they're not so clear. Let's talk about an employee that lifts a heavy object at work and maybe feels a twinge in his back. He doesn't feel disabled, so he may not work. He may work the rest of the shift. Some employees even feel responsible to the employer to get the job completed, so they may not say anything right away, and they just get the job done. They go home, but his back might start hurting him a lot more when he's home because of medically because of inflammation setting in. And then he comes in the next day, and then he tells the supervisor or he tells the safety officer he hurt his back in the job the day before. And sometimes, unfortunately, he might do it on Friday, and then he might tell you on Monday. And that delay in reporting can frequently make you suspicious about fraud. And I think another word might be abuse. Workplace illnesses like dust diseases and skin irritations, and I know you guys have that, also can pose a problem because an employee may not figure out right away that his problem's work-related. So there may be a delay in reporting for that, which again raises questions about fraud. In those cases, it's best to put your suspicions aside and make sure you complete a good injury investigation. Get the facts of the case. Every reported injury or illness should get a fair, impartial review by the safety officer to gather all known information and avoid any suggestions of impropriety or unfair treatment, no matter how bogus it might sound. That review will definitely help weed out fraudulent or abuse cases. So how can a safety officer help identify fraudulent cases? Well, first, never directly accuse an employee or even mention word one of fraud or any suspicions, but keep an eye out for red flags if you think your employee is being less than honest. It's always helpful if employees know you as advocates for their health and well-being and safety, and any questions you might have are meant to help them and prevent further occurrences. People may lie or they may magnify a situation, but your approach should remain the same. Gather all available information and ensure the employee's complaints of injuries are being dealt with and they get sent to your designated occupational medicine provider for evaluation.
So, Phil, hey, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about some possible red flags that you discussed a little bit more. If you can lead more into that for us, please.
Sure. Well, depending upon the type of injury, there should be one or more witnesses to an event, as any busy workplace. It's common that workers will at least complain to each other if they're hurting or in pain from something. An employee may fall at a work site when no one is looking, but it's likely he'll tell one of his coworkers about it that he can tell you about. Being the closest to the work site, the safety officers should look for witnesses to an event or someone who might corroborate the report that they're getting from the employee. Ask the employee if there was a witness or someone he told about the fall. Try talking to his friends and coworkers. You don't have to make it an inquisition, but it really needs to be done to help the employee prove or support his claim for injury. So in that way, it can be done for the employee, not necessarily to support some case of fraud. At least other employees will remember that if they report an injury, then questions will be asked. And that alone might deter any further fraud or abuse. Lack of a witness doesn't mean the work comp claim will be denied if the history supports the type of injury, but it sure doesn't hurt.
No, and I fully agree with that. So an easy way to validate, somebody, the employer, the individual who got hurt, report is maybe possibly, some places might have security cameras. So you might be able to pull the footage out there, and also, getting possible sworn statements from a fellow worker who was there on the scene when it actually happened.
Absolutely, and I've had a claim where an individual reported falling on the employer's steps, but there was a camera and there was no incident on the security footage, and the employee had tried to change her story, but we were able to successfully deny the claim anyway. Here's another red flag. An employee waited to report an incident with no valid explanation for the delay. How many times have you heard that one?
Multiple times.
Every employee should receive initial and periodic training about his employer's policies to report injuries as soon as possible, preferably immediately after an event. And if he violates those policies, he should have some form of explanation. However, it's important to keep in mind there can be a lot of extraneous factors leading to a delay. For instance, a guy can twist his knee, but it doesn't start hurting him a lot until the next day. We probably all had that if we're workers. Or a guy can sustain an injury, but he's afraid of losing his paycheck if he stays off work, so he doesn't say anything right away. Maybe another confusing type of injury is one caused by repetitive trauma, where there's no one incident causing pain or injury. It's just repetitive over days and weeks, maybe even years. And think of a guy swinging a hammer or using a jackhammer repeatedly. He may be used to using them, but maybe one job requires him to use it more and more excessively than he's used to. And the result can be a tendonitis in his hands or his arms or his shoulders. And that starts gradually, it just gets worse. A friendly safety officer should have some familiarity with employees to really know what they're like, what they're capable of, what they say seems to be valid or not. Another red flag that can be teased out with the initial investigation is an inconsistent story. An employee reports a fall in one location, and later he changes the story saying, it didn't happen there, it happened somewhere else. He may say an incident happened in the morning, then later report it being the afternoon. And this is where a well-written initial investigation comes in handy. And that investigation could be provided to the employer's human resource person that deals with work comp claims and inevitably to the workers' compensation claim examiner, even if the employee has a lapse of memory later on in the claim, which we all will do because some of these claims they can go on for years. And, our memories just don't hold up. But if you've got a good initial report, that's something that can be prevented and, provided to the judge in a court case. Even if the employee has a lapse of memory later on, like I said, the claim administrator will have that initial investigation to report back to. I can't tell you how many times as a claim adjuster that I didn't have an initial injury investigation and the story went one way and then another and another. Consequently, the employee could alter the story any way they seemed convenient, and you couldn't argue against it in any way.
No, and I fully agree with that, Phil. I also think, you brought up a very good point there, about getting the initial report, up and going and everything else, because you also have to take into account too the type of injury. Obviously, if you have to provide any kind of some level 1 CPR, so forth and everything else. I mean, you got a lot of stuff going on. The person's doing CPR, you want to be trying to ask him, hey, what happened here? And you got to wait a little bit. And everybody's going to have their different views on what all happened and how it happened because, in the heat of the moment like that there, you're going to be dealing with a lot of emotions and stuff going on. So I definitely agree with that one there. Now, what about those injuries that are, just conveniently, it happens every once in a while, reported just before a long weekend. And we do have a long weekend coming up, 4th of July weekend. We've all had those here. Can you give us some insight on those, please?
Yeah, and they can almost be expected. It just happens. And that is definitely a red flag, particularly if it occurs more than once. And when these red flags happen, they happen in pairs or more. There's always more than one. And it's always suspicious when an injury occurs right before a holiday weekend or 3 days off, so 3 days off gets stretched to 4 or more. And this kind of thing is a common form of abuse in workers' compensation, but may not be actual fraud unless there's no injury at all in the first place. Reported injuries also become suspect if they occur right after disciplinary action. That happens. Or right before the individual is about ready to retire. I've had that happen more than once. Or maybe there's a projected rumor about a layoff. All of a sudden you start seeing an increase in the number of reported injuries. Another situation a safety officer can look out for is the occurrence of repeated injuries. And here's where you know these things are happening. And the claim examiner won't, because he may not have any history other than that one claim. And yes, some people are accident prone, but we're not talking about them. We're talking about the repeat back injuries or sprain that someone reports. Certainly they can occur, but it's helpful to remain suspicious of such things and be ready to look into the claims more closely if they occur, even if it's only to make sure they don't keep happening, much less for a workers' compensation claim.
Great points, Phil. I got a quick question for you. Some of your statements, you mentioned that, we should always send an injured employee for a medical evaluation. And I truly get that because that helps us stay ahead of the management system of it. The sooner we get them in there, the more that we can potentially stop fraud. And as you mentioned, it's very important to have a very thorough initial investigation. But what if an individual refuses to go? Would that be a problem?
Yeah, what if they refuse to go to see your designated occupational health clinic, for an evaluation? What if they refuse to go? Well, that is certainly a red flag for fraud. And obviously, individuals without injuries are going to act reluctant to go to a doctor. But most fraudulent individuals will have the smarts to complain of pain without obvious signs of injuries. And they may go anyway because they know that there's no way for the doctor to really prove whether they got pain or not. But in those cases, you have to leave some of the decisions to the occupational medicine provider to tease out what is legitimate and what is not. But the point is, you're getting the individual to someone who can help you make that determination. You may also have the situation where an individual says he wants to go to his own doctor, or possible that he's already been to his own doctor. Well, in the state of Nebraska, this is very important, an employee has the right to choose his treating physician, but employer still has the right to send an individual to their designated doctor of their choice, of the employer's choice, for an evaluation and opinion.
Okay, so you got to help me in this here, Phil. You have referenced an occupational medicine, medicine provider mails. What is that exactly?
Yeah, it's a specialty in medicine. An occupational medicine physician is a doctor that has specific training and experience in the diagnosis and treatment of work-related injuries and illnesses. They frequently have familiarity with the employer's work and facilities, and they visited those facilities and become familiar with them. So when the employee reports an injury, the physician can make sense, and he can say, hey, I know where that occurred. I've been there, or I know what that individual does. I've seen it. The cause of some injuries are obvious, like a worker cuts his hand with a knife or drops a concrete block on his foot. But other conditions are not, and we need a medical professional that understands work-relatedness, work and injuries, and the relationship to those to answer the big question, whether the reported condition is work-related. Are the employee's complaints consistent with the work they perform or the work conditions in which they work? When talking about repetitive trauma issues or back pain or specific illnesses, that is not a question which most primary care physicians are comfortable providing an answer. So when an employee reports having been injured at work or getting ill from work, send him to your designated occupational medicine provider who can be certain to answer the questions about work relationship right away. I had a claim where an individual reported pushing a heavy cart at work, but my occupational medicine provider had some familiarity with the work because he'd been there and he knew what the individuals had to do for a job. And he found the employee's report to be inconsistent in that he didn't have to push anything heavy at work. That was very helpful.
So, Phil, with all the information that you're providing us, it's great information. Dropping a lot of bombs, as Bradley would say.
You ain't kidding. They're blowing up everywhere around here. My mind is going
blowing
right now, trying to wrap my brain around some of this stuff.
Absolutely.
Man, just some of the little single words that you phrased out really changes the whole investigation part, the way you said it. It's just amazing. And some of the stuff that we've talked about with the several red flags for workers' compensation claims. But what is a safety officer to do with that information once they find out, hey, this doesn't seem right and it's truly a red flag? What can we actually do with it? How do we move forward with it?
Exactly. Well, inconsistencies and suspicions on your part as safety officers can be reported to the occupational medicine provider or the human resources designated person who works with the claims or workers' compensation claims. And they can consider the information when making decisions whether an injury is work-related or real. And that information can be reported on to the claim examiner, because every employer has to have a workers' compensation program, and you'll have an insurance program, an insurance provider, and the insurance provider needs to be reported. The individual needs to be reported to the insurance provider, who designates a claim adjuster, and then he or she handles that work comp claim. And it's essential that the post-injury investigation be provided to the adjuster. But a safety officer can also contact the adjuster directly to let them know about any suspicions that might be better left undocumented. So, because a lot of this stuff you may want to just keep in a verbal form or oral form. The adjuster can then use all the available information to determine if further actions are needed or the claim needs to be further looked into. For instance, I just started managing a claim and was notified by a safety officer of several of his ongoing concerns about the claim, I thanked him for the information. I documented it and started investigating further. And I later talked the case over with the occupational medicine provider, and I was able to deny the claim based on all the information provided. That was very helpful. It doesn't happen very much, but in this case, it was very helpful. But most of the time, though, that information that you gather helps the employee support his claim, because in the state of Nebraska, the employee is responsible for providing proof of injury. And he does that by, one, reporting the injury right away, and then going to see a doctor for evaluation and treatment if he needs it.
Now, I know we keep referencing Nebraska because I know you've done most of your work in the state of Nebraska and everything else, and where Corey and I currently are working at is in the state of Nebraska. But can you help us learn a little bit more about how close other states work together? Are some of them like kind of overlapping, or how big of a difference is? And use, for example, like, we're us being right here in Omaha, Nebraska, we have Iowa right next door. And with the companies that we work with, we can actually go into Iowa and also in Nebraska. Can you possibly give us any insight on how close each state is on their rules on workers' comp by choice, by chance, man?
For your job as a safety officer, I would think it's fair to say it's the same across all states. States do have differences in their workers' compensation programs. They all have basically a similar program, but they have some very, very important differences. For instance, the state of Nebraska has a 7-day waiting period when the individual doesn't get paid unless he's off work for 6 weeks or more. Then the claim adjuster will go ahead and pay him for those 7 days. Those rules might be different in another state, but they really don't have a lot to do with anything to do with your jobs as a safety officer. But they're very, very important.
Okay, I'm gonna ask a question. Then, obviously, workers' comp. There's always two sides to every story. So I want you to be able to possibly give us some advice and also our listeners advice as fellow safety officers on what points that you should be bringing home to us and everything else to be paying attention on. And then I kind of want to turn the script a little bit, because guess what? We're talking about how we can help identify fraud and everything else. But then we'll go ahead and get into the questions that some of the workers might not know what their benefits and some of the rights are to workers' comp. So could you give us maybe a top 5 or a top 10 or a little brief lessons that we might need to make sure we're paying attention to as safety officers before we start discussing, some of the rights that the workers that they have that they might not know about?
Well, absolutely important to make sure and tell them again and again and again to report their injuries right away. They got to hear it again and again and again, and that's so important. And then once they do report their injury, do whatever you can to help them file a claim, which means fill out. Every employer has a first report of injury form or some documentation that's used to document their injury, their claim, and then that goes to the employer's insurance carrier, who has a responsibility to report that then to go on to the state. So make sure you do what you can to help them get that claim documented.
Okay.
And then it's so important, like we talked about, to get that safety post-injury investigation done, to get at the root cause of what's going on, but also to document the facts as the employee states, so that you can use that for any future use in a claim.
That is a lot of really good points to be brought up and everything else, because a lot of those little fine things can slip through the crack. I'm going to kind of circle back to what we've talked about before. I mentioned about, giving CPR, trying to get somebody's, try and get the most updated information and so forth written down, because stories do change and everything else. So here's my mind again thinking, the ball's in left field. I'm in right field in this one here. let's say the person was, severely injured on the job and everything, and you're trying to get the stories from your fellow witnesses and so forth. And, next thing you know, they come up to you and say, hey, something's not right here. Because, I was witness to the accident. I saw what happened, to Johnny over there or Tim or whoever. And I'm having problems with working now because now I have PTSD from it. Can that be a workers' comp claim?
Mental claims can be a real challenge.
Okay.
And you really have to go to the state laws to determine whether a claim for a mental illness, anxiety, some form of that might be compensable. In the state of Nebraska, a mental claim has to be due. The mental disorder has to be a direct result of a physical injury. So an individual, suffers say a bad fall, and we've had these cases where they may fall, 30 feet down. And, they start having some severe anxiety now about even looking at a ladder. Well, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, direct related to a physical injury. And I bet everybody can kind of have it if they've been in an auto accident or any kind of accident, they can relate to that. But if it's not just simply that, hey, I'm being treated bad at work, so I'm under a lot of stress, so I have a lot of anxiety and I can't work. That's not compensable. Or even I have PTSD because maybe I'm on the scene. I come on the scene of after an injury happened and there's blood, or maybe even I saw the fall.
Right.
If I wasn't injured, I can't that PTSD. Even if I had it, even if you got a doctor saying you got it, isn't compensable because it's not tied to a physical injury. Your physical injury.
Okay. No, like I said, that definitely clears a lot of it up because, obviously, PTSD, mental health and everything else is a big topic going forward. And it's just one of those things that popped in my mind. I just had to ask it.
That was an excellent question because now that you just summed it up, Phil, about physicality, I was curious about the mental side of it, workman's comp. If we filed a claim, can workman's comp fix stupid? Because we and if so, would there be a statute of limitation on filing a workers' comp claim?
Well,
But no, seriously, just going through is there a statute of limitations on filing a workers' comp claim?
Good question, and there is, and it's actually 2 years. But an employer can also maybe not successfully, if the employee knows they got injured and there's a serious delay in reporting, say maybe even more than 6 months, the employer may be able to deny a claim based on failure to report as soon as practicable. But in general, there's a 2-year statute of limitations in the state of Nebraska.
Okay. Let's get down, all workers and everything else, we all want to make a buck and everything else. We talked about, they're getting their claims, there could be a delay in the money and everything else. How long on average, and this is for the state of Nebraska or straight across the whole United States, how long does it usually take for a worker to be able to receive that first paycheck?
Yes, and this is a real point of disillusionment or anger in claims that employees don't know. In the state of Nebraska, there's a 7-day waiting period, and that's calendar days. It's not work days. It's 7 days a week. But anyway, there's a 7-day waiting period where you don't get paid for if you're off work. The exception is if you're off work for more than 6 weeks, then they have to go back and pay you for the first 7 weeks or the first 7 days.
Huh. It's
during those
7 days.
During those 7 days, you might have to use your PTO time. If you have it, you have PTO or some illness, benefits that you might have. But employees get very upset about this when they find this out because most people don't know anything about workers' compensation until they need it, and then they're off work and they think they're going to get paid right away, and they don't. Then they get very upset.
I wonder if you could use that as a bullet in your gun. You know, you don't, sometimes you give too much information to somebody, they'll know how to take advantage of it. If you gave them this information, have you ever seen it to work for the better?
Oh, it's definitely it definitely prevents abuse. I'm not sure it would prevent fraud, but it's definitely prevents abuse. If people know they're not going to get paid for those first 7 days, it definitely helps prevent abuse in workers' compensation.
And so with the pay, when they start getting paid, how do they figure the amount that we'll be getting, and is it tax free?
Yeah, yes. Anything you get paid in workers' compensation is going to be tax free, but the amount they get paid it gets complicated here. This is a reason why some people actually go for and get professional help. It's 2/3 of your average weekly wage for the last 26 weeks of work. So the claim examiner has to they have to get a report from the employer what you've been paid over the last 26 weeks and figure out 2/3 of that. And that could include bonuses, commissions, and I'm sure you can come up with some other things. But
Overtime?
Nope, it does not include overtime.
No, it does not. Okay.
Nope. But
Wow.
it does include straight time for those extra hours you worked.
Okay.
But not the overtime.
Okay.
And you understand? But people get very upset when they find out they're not going to get paid their full salary. So it's really 2/3 of what they're normally making. And when you're living hand to mouth, like some workers are, that can be very difficult.
No, I agree. And with the way the gas prices are these days, you brought up a thing about people working, paycheck to paycheck. And these people are going to have to go to get medical treatment and everything else, go see a doctor or whatnot to be able to keep on working their claim and everything else. Even while they're drawing their workers' comp, do they get like a reimbursement or a stipend for driving back and forth to these doctor appointments because now they're told they have to?
Yes. And that's something that employees frequently don't know about. They can get paid up to 62 cents a mile when they have to go see their doctor, or they have to go to therapy 3 times a week. They can get paid if they keep a nice log and they can provide that to their claim examiner. They can get a nice 62 cents or more per mile.
Huh. All right.
And they can also, if they have to go out of town, let's say they live in a rural county, like they're out in Norfolk and they have to come to Omaha. They're going to be on the road for more than 4 hours, maybe.
Right.
They can actually get a per diem for food up to a certain limit. There's a certain stipend they can get, so you can get paid for that.
How about for like hotel? Like you talked about, some of these places are up and things.
Yes, even that, if they have to be put up in a hotel in order to get that medical care or that evaluation, that therapy. Yes.
All right.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that.
That's very interesting. What do they base the per diem on? Like what they would normally get if they were a traveler?
There's a set amount. I can't remember. It's been a while, and I don't know what the current rate is. It's not very much. I mean, it could be $30 or something. I'm not sure at this point.
Gotcha. How long can they? So say all this is taking place and all the time frame is started, the claim has gone through. How long can a person collect workers' comp for?
A long time, depending on the injury. Most injuries, and I mean most injuries, individual gets hurt, they bang their hand, they have a week or two, maybe 3 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, and they get over it. The doctor releases them from care. That ends the claim, except for if they've suffered a permanent injury, a permanent impairment. Then they may maybe do some benefits, financial benefits for that. But some claims can go on for quite a long time. And as long as that individual is receiving medical care, they can receive benefits. As long as they're off work, they're receiving benefits. And then they can receive benefits if there's it becomes a permanent injury, then they can receive benefits for that permanent injury.
Now, you brought up the thing about permanent injuries, and I hate to go with the thing about the dark side of this and everything else, but I mean, let's just say, if a person gets killed on a job site, hopefully it never happens, but it does happen out there. Can the person like next of kin file the workers' comp claim for them? And if so, I mean, what kind of benefits are they entitled to, if they are entitled to any?
Absolutely. They can file a work comp claim. And generally, they do that by getting a hold of the employer's human resource office. And then that it can go from there. First report of injuries filed from that point on. And of course, the claim's going to be investigated. And but the spouse can receive benefits they get benefits of 2/3 the average weekly wage for the rest of their life unless they remarry. If they remarry, then they'll get 2 years. They'll get 2 years of benefits after that. But it's for the rest of their life, and some of that money can be designated for the children. So maybe 50% goes to the wife, and the rest goes to the children. And the children can receive benefits up to age 19 or I think 26 while they're in school or something. I forget on that one, but yes, they do get benefits, and they get them for a long time.
So now, kind of going on more of that, there is, can there be a workers' comp claim and also a like, say they want to get a lawyer and sue that company? Can those two run simultaneously at the same time, or would that be almost like double dipping?
Yeah, you're talking about a wrongful death claim, and I think that if an individual has, if something happens like a death, and they think that it's a wrongful death, meaning there's somebody that's really willfully negligent, they need to bring that to a lawyer and let a lawyer sort that out. The lawyer may be able to file both, or they may only be able to file the work comp claim. It really is a complex matter and needs to be sorted out by a professional.
You mentioned something with the person gets killed, can the next of kin file? And you talked about the spouse remarrying, but if the spouse remarries, does the kids' entitlement cut off at that time too? Or do they get it till they're 19 to 26 or whatever the age is possible?
It continues.
Okay. So the kids get it after the spouse remarries. The spouse will get it for an extra 2 years, and then that's cut.
To my knowledge, yes.
Okay. Gotcha.
Hey, Corey, the only thing I know is, man, don't ever tell my wife about that, okay? Holy cow, dude. She might, I'm just
right?
kidding. My wife would never do that there. I love her to death and everything else. I know she would, dude. I just had to crack a joke because we were talking about some morbid stuff there for a little bit. That's the reason why I had to kind of cheer it up a little bit.
Well, another thing,
that was a great segue.
Another place that you're involved as safety officers, it's important to send these individuals that get injured for evaluation because you have to worry about OSHA reporting.
Yes.
And we all know that in OSHA reporting, you have to know if there's need for medical care beyond first aid. And How do you know that? Well, you know that because you're going to send somebody for evaluation. And then from that point on, the individual can decide whether or not who's going to treat them. But you're in the loop on that one.
Yeah, no, and I agree. Me and Corey and I, we've seen each other multiple times in our medical aid station there, working with our medics for people who've gotten dinged up on a job and everything else. It's one of those things where I know they've lightened us a couple times on, one's classified as first aid and one is not classified as first aid. So you definitely hit the nail on the head on that one there. But yeah, like I said, I mean, so far the information you gave us so far has just totally blown my mind. Corey, you got any more questions there for? I can't say Dr. Phil because that's already trademarked and everything.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued about the first statement that you came to and told us about when the reporting needed to be done as soon as practicable.
Right.
Is there? I know you gave a good explanation on it, and I guess it's just to interpretation or somebody's discretion. But is there any time that you can actually put a time on when practicable would have been feasible and they didn't, and then the denying of the claim leads more in your favor?
I couldn't give you a number because every case is different. Every medical case can be different. So it's really hard to say what's reasonable. But there is some case law, and a lawyer can look at the case law and decide whether it applies to a case. So every employer's insurance carrier is going to have a legal advisor, and the claim examiner can talk to their legal advisor about whether or not something has been reported as soon as practicable or not, based on the case.
Another
Gotcha.
thing, another thing
Okay.
I was just thinking about there when he was talking about that. I worked for some companies before that has done this here, and some of them haven't done it before. What's your thoughts on possibly trying to eliminate some of these red flags that a person might have got injured from a previous job or whatnot? What is your professional opinion on possibly having some employees send them for a physical before they start working to get almost like a baseline, so that the injury's been around for a while and everything else, or they're just not trying to play the game to try and score a early retirement or something like that there. So what's your opinion on possibly doing a fit for duty physical, and then that way you have a baseline to kind of go from there? What's your thoughts on that, Phil?
Very important for a number of reasons, particularly for down the road if there's a workers' compensation claim. Sending an individual for call it a pre-hire physical, for lack of a better claim. At that point, the medical provider can do a good medical history and gather information, assuming the employee's reports will report an accurate history, but he can gather a good history. Now, that means that he might learn that the individual has had back pain, or maybe he's had a bum shoulder, he's had surgery on. But that doesn't mean that he can't do the job. So it's important that the employer has defined the functions of the job that the employee is going to do and the physical requirements of those jobs. So you should know what those physical requirements are, and then the medical provider working with, say, the right therapist, because generally physical therapy gets involved in this, they can design medical exams to determine whether or not an individual is physically capable of doing a job based on the functions of the job as they've been defined. But also a medical provider, especially a occupational medicine provider, can determine whether or not it's even safe for an individual to do a job. Say the individual has to lift 75 pounds on a regular occurrence, and the individual has a lumbar fusion, or a cervical fusion, or some serious injury like that in the past that they've been treated. He can, a medical professional can say, this is not safe for this individual to do that job. Doesn't happen a lot, and you can't discriminate against somebody, but it has to be based on professional opinion, and that provider better be able to support his opinion.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, we're getting ready to run out of time real quick. I'm gonna say a few things here, Corey, then I'll turn it back over to you to finish closing everything out there. But I definitely want to thank you, Phil, for being on our show today and everything else. I also want to thank you for your 20 plus years of military service that you provided for this country and everything else. And I definitely would love to bring you back on the show later on to discuss some more topics that our listeners might have, or that Corey and I might have as well too. Because you've definitely opened up the can of worms in my brain here and got me thinking everything else. We can sit here and talk for hours about this. I know we can.
You're welcome.
But like I said, I definitely would like to bring you back on in a couple of weeks or so. So with that being said, Corey, I'll go ahead and I'll be quiet here. I'll turn it over to you there, buddy, and I'll let you say your closing remarks, and we'll wrap this bad boy up.
Man, I think you closed it out pretty good, Steve. Phil, I just want to say thanks for joining our podcast. It was great, and like Steve said, I've got these little hamsters on that wheel just turning right now about this workman's comp information with the information that you provided. It was phenomenal. And with our open discussion that we leave for our listeners, I'm sure some might have questions or some might actually have some situations that are brought up. We might get some from. So if you would definitely love to have you back if we get more feedback from our listeners and what certain situations would be. And as Steve said, man, thanks so much for your service. Everything that you've done, you're very distinguished. All your certifications, just a very intelligent, wisdomful person that I could just probably sit on the front porch with and just talk to and chew the fat for hours.
Well, you're welcome.
Interesting.
And
very, very interesting.
thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, that's it for our podcast, everybody. Hope y'all enjoyed the show. As always, please call, leave messages, leave responses if you got anything that you'd like for Steve and I to discuss. And if you got anything for Phil coming up from his information on workman's comp, please leave it and we'll make sure he gets the questions and we'll get the answers responded back to y'all. Thanks a lot, and look forward to seeing y'all on the next podcast.
Giddy up.